Okay, so this is my first wrap up for the month of January. I read a lot of short books, so now that I'm doing stats again at the beginning of wrap ups, it feels like it looks skewed. But it's just because I read a lot of short books. Okay, let's talk. So for the books that I started and finished in the month of January, I read 6 books and 8 volumes of manga. Additionally, there were 2 books and 1 additional manga that I started outside of the month of January and just finished this month. For genres, I read a good variety of genres, still fantasy leaning, always fantasy leaning, but I had a good mix in there, I think. And I guess kind of low-key spoilers for the video, my favorite book that I read this month was Guards, and my least favorite was The Climber. Let me know in future wrap-ups if you like having this particular stat, my favorite and least favorite, here at the beginning of the video, or if I need to move that to the end. As is the nature of wrap-ups, this is going to be a collection of short, spoiler-free reviews where I talk about all the things that I read this month, but if you like more in-depth discussions, I have a second channel where I do weekly reading vlogs, where I do spoiler-free, more detailed discussion week to week, keeping you up to date on what I'm reading, as well as spoiler-filled, dedicated reviews for my favorite books that I read each month. So check that out if you want to. I also, if you want even more, I have a Patreon where we buddy read basically everything I read there. All the manga that I read is discussed volume by volume on my Patreon, and most of the books are either organized server-wide buddy reads or books that I'm breaking off with members of the Patreon and buddy reading individually or in little groups. Plus I'm just there a lot, so you know, we can hang out, talk. First book that I finished this month was Tress of the Emerald Sea. This is the first secret project that Sanderson put out. I have a dedicated spoiler-filled review for it, as well as talked about it in a reading vlog, spoiler-free. I really enjoyed this book. The concept for this was that Sanderson was watching the Princess Bride movie with his family, and the idea was, what if Buttercup had a little bit more agency? What if she took matters into her own hands a little bit more? And this is a very whimsical, silly, goofy, fun adventure about a girl who is content in life and content with her hobbies and her job and her island and, you know, this island that she's never allowed to leave because of the nature of the ocean that surrounds her. And then whenever the boy that she loves is in danger, she sets out in this sea that she can't touch for reasons to go rescue him. Along the way, she meets other characters and she goes, it's an adventure. It's a lighthearted, whimsical, fun, silly, goofy, exciting adventure with Sanderson flair, with his cool magic, cool way of making it a really unique kind of world. His love for connecting all of his stories, so just kind of dropping Cosmere bits everywhere. And it was really fun. I had a really, really good time with this story. For me, there were some elements to the plot itself that I found predictable, which I really rarely find with Sanderson, but with this one in particular, I did find that to be true. As well as one particular character that played a significant role for the plot that I found to be pretty underwhelming and not very interesting. But other than those 2 complaints, man, I had a good time with this book. I loved the way I loved the humor and the whimsy and the silliness and the personal arc and adventure that Tress herself went under. I loved all the little Easter eggs. I just had a great time with this. It was one of Sanderson's lighter stories. It was one of his less complex and intense and emotionally, you know, focused story. It was a lot of fun. Next thing I read this month was The Climber, which I read volume 6 of The Climber. I didn't have strong feelings about it. I didn't really care for it that much. Yeah, it's a series that started out really strong and then was kind of decreasing for me. And then after I finished volume 6, I started volume 7 and promptly DNF'd to the series. I know there's a few people that are huge fans of The Climber that were really excited to see me read it, and I'm sorry to you, but it's not gonna be the one for me. I really, really enjoyed the rock climbing elements, but then there were other elements that I was really, really not enjoying, and eventually I decided, you know what? There's other stuff to read. I don't want to read this. Just really super not for me. Didn't work out. Next book I finished was a book that I started in December and finished in January, and that's House of Chains. This is book 4 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. I adore this series. I've been taking it very, very, very slowly, but have been blown away by it. This is my least favorite installment of the 4 that I've read so far, but still very, very strong. Erikson really impressed me in this book, specifically in his ability to create complex characters that are presented to me in one way in their introduction, and then through a journey, I learn so much, and so much evolves, and it's such, he just has this ability to write such complex types of characters. In that, he also confused me a ton, and he brought some things together, and hurt me deeply. And I am committing, after this book, to try to pick up my pace with Malazan a little bit. I still need a break between books because they are very, very heavy. There's a lot going on in these books that are tough for me. But with that said, I want to continue with the series very badly. I want to see where he's going with these characters and with the story and how things are going to come together. So I plan on picking up book 5 within the next few months. Hopefully I'll pick it up either in March or April is the goal. I don't know if that's a very strong endorsement. I do have a spoiler-filled review for this book on the second channel. So if you've missed that, if you're a Malazan fan and you want to discuss it further with me, you can. But I do love the series, despite it taking a lot out of me. Boy, oh boy, do I love it. Next, I finished Arm of the Sphinx. Nope, that's book 1. Whoops. Arm of the Sphinx, which is book 2 after Finland Ascends. I do have a spoiler-filled review for book 1 on the second channel from when I read it last month, but I do not have a spoiler-filled review for book 2, and there probably won't be one. But I am going to do a spoiler-filled discussion on the series with some other booktubers whenever I do finish the series. This was a little bit less for me. I liked this one a little bit less than book 1. I was really, really excited for book 2 after finishing book 1, which if you don't know, this follows Finland, who comes to visit the Tower of Babel, which is this mysterious, interesting tower that nobody really knows a lot about, and he's come to vacation there, or honeymoon there, with his wife, who he immediately loses because he's a dope. And book 1 is him ascending the first few floors of this mysterious, strange, chaotic tower to try to find his wife. And each floor has its own kind of chaos that you kind of have to get through in order to get to the next floor. And people try to ascend the tower, and it rarely works out for people. And so that's what book 1 was. Book 2 went in a really different direction than I expected. Oh my goodness. And that's not why. A lot of people, when I say I have certain expectations, and then those expectations are not met, and then I don't like the thing as much, people are like, well, it's your fault for expecting meh, meh, meh. But no, that's not what's happening. I'm totally chill with expecting something from a sequel and not getting that something. I want authors to do whatever is right for their story, but like sometimes I'm just not gonna like the sequel as much. And book 2, basically everything that I loved about book 1, book 2 just like didn't do very much of, unfortunately. But it also did certain things that I really needed it to do, specifically character work. The characters themselves were deepened a lot in this book, and the character relationships among each other, their interactions and their bond was deepened a ton, which is definitely the shining star of this sequel for me. And while I anticipated getting more world building out of book 2, and it didn't come the way I expected, I did still get that. I understand the tower a little bit more. I have a few answers and a lot more questions, and I understand some of the behind the scenes mechanics and inner workings of it a little bit more after book 2, which I really, really appreciate, even if I didn't get it quite the way I expected. But this book felt like a little bit less focused than book 1. Book 1, there was a goal, there was an intention, and there was a thing that we were doing, and book 2 kind of just felt all over the place a little bit, and I didn't love that. I just didn't follow, I wasn't into the plot of this one so much, even though the plot is kind of the same. But then also where we landed at the end of book 2, I have no idea what to expect out of book 3. So I don't know. I'm not gonna read book 3 in February because I wanted to read the sequel to The Blade itself in February, and I just didn't. I had too many books on my TBR and I did get to it, but I desperately want to. So The Trouble with Peace is what I'm gonna make a priority in February, and then The Hod King will probably be pushed to March, but I will continue with the series and we'll see. We'll see. Next book I finished is another book that I started in previous months, I think in December for this one as well, and finished in January, and that's Inheritance. This is the conclusion to the Aragon series. What's it called? The Inheritance Cycle. It's the conclusion to the Inheritance Cycle. Eragon, the first 3 books of Eragon were my favorite books in middle school and early high school. And I read and reread those 3 books so many times. But when book 4 came out, I actually just never finished it. I didn't even really have a good reason. I just lost interest, I guess. So one of my mods over on my Patreon and I have been buddy reading this series. We've been rereading it. He has finished the series, but I never did. So we've been rereading the first 3 and then we finally read book 4 together and it's fine. It's fine. I think that the big conclusion, the defeating the big bad, the climax of the whole series was pretty underwhelming. But other than that, the falling action was good. After all that happened, what happened next I enjoyed, and I'm a big fan of good falling action, so I did really enjoy the end of the end, but I was pretty underwhelmed by like the big end. Overall, I love a good dragon book. This is an interesting world, it's an interesting magic system, the characters are fine, it's very indulgent. Goes on and on and on and on and on about stuff that I don't care about and I don't think needed to be expanded on to that level. But I'm also a hypocrite because I'm a giant fan of The Lord of the Rings, so what do you want from me? I don't know, it was fine. It was good. I'm glad that I finally know the conclusion to one of my childhood favorite series. And I had fun discussing it with a friend. Next book I finished is Grown. This is by Tiffany D. Jackson. She wrote Monday Is Not Coming and The Weight of Blood. This is the 3rd book of hers that I've read, and it's fantastic. As I said in a reading vlog, Tiffany D. Jackson doesn't write books about fun topics. She writes books about important topics, and this one is about grooming. It follows a girl named Enchanted who is a very, very talented singer and who would like to make a space for herself in the music industry, and she ends up meeting a well-established musician. He takes great advantage of her. Tiffany D. Jackson has an incredible ability to write very difficult, nuanced, tough topics, explore it from many angles, and write very impactful lines that will make at least me as a reader stop and think and want to discuss, as well as being compulsively readable. Her books, I never want to put down. I never feel fatigued or feel like stopping. I just burn through them. And while also having that level of impact, she's very readable, but also very impactful, and she's very, very talented in that way. Grown to me was her narratively weakest book that I've read of hers so far, just in the sense of how I just needed more pages. There were times where scenes would abruptly end and then we would just be at another scene where there's like been some sort of time jump, whether just a very short one, like a few days, or longer, and it's not really addressed. Like things that it feels like they need to be fleshed out a little bit more, and they're just not. So in that sense, it reads a bit like there are important things, important scenes that Tiffany D. Jackson wanted to write, and so she wrote those first, and then the thread that connects them, she just never went back and kind of fleshed those bits out a little bit more, if that makes sense. That even happens sometimes in scenes where characters would be on one side of the room and then all of a sudden they'd be on the other side without any sort of narrative movement from them, which sounds so nitpicky, but it kept drawing me out of the book that I was otherwise completely engaged in. I don't know, has anyone else, because this is one of her more recent books. This was published in 2020. So it surprised me because it felt almost like an earlier book for her in that sense. All that said, it was a phenomenal book. It was a book that had so much impact. It was a book that explored a young girl being taken advantage of, and people's neglect, people's reactions and responses, people's failure of response, people's perceptions and ideals, and how these sort of things get let go and perpetuated, and how these things continue because of the way people respond to victims, the way people brush things off, the justifications that people make, and the justifications people make for putting more weight on the victim than that victim deserves. It's so short and it's so compulsively readable while also having so much impact and so many discussions packed in there for us to unpack. Tiffany D. Jackson has proved herself to me again and again as an author that I will keep revisiting, and that every time I revisit, I will organize a buddy read for because her books need to be discussed. Next thing I read was Yona of the Dawn. This month I read volumes 4 through 6. Last month I read volumes 1 through 3. And last month I was kind of lukewarm on it. I felt kind of surface level, very, very rushed. Feeling much stronger about it now. These last 3 volumes, we've slowed down a lot. We're introducing characters and plot lines that are so good. I'm getting so attached. Yona herself has grown so much in these volumes, and I'm so digging her character, but also some of the side characters that are getting introduced, I'm very, very, very attached to. And what we're doing right now in the plot, I'm really, really enjoying. I'm just having a wonderful time with this series, and I'm really excited because this is a series that in the first 3 volumes, I really wasn't sure if I was going to be into it, and now I'm feeling really, really strongly, I feel good about it. I feel like this is gonna be one that I'm gonna have a really good time with, so I'm super excited about that. Next book I finished was, now we're in the vacation arc. Now we're in the books that I read on vacation, so I'll kind of speed through those a little bit more because 1, I just posted a video about these books, and 2, thank you y'all for showing it so much love. That video actually performed super well when I totally didn't expect it to, but I'm so glad that so many of you enjoyed it. I loved putting together that video. I had so much fun making it, and I was really excited to share it. And y'all, you were so encouraging, the comments. Y'all were like, you really had a good time with me, and it made me feel so good. So I'll get through these books quickly because we just discussed them. Guards. Incredible. This is my introduction to Discworld, and I'm completely hooked. The first lead that we're introduced to is Carrot, who's a man who is raised in a dwarven society by dwarven parents, but he is a human, and he keeps growing, so his parents have to break the news to him that you're human, and you should probably find your way in human society now. So he joins the Guards, which is this backwards society group of people, and they're tasked with hunting down a dragon. It's hilarious. I underlined almost every page. There was almost every page had an underline in it. I was laughing out loud constantly, but there were also really great discussions in there about humanity and how far people are willing to go, what people are willing to justify when faced in really difficult situations, leadership and royalty, and oh my golly, so many really, really good discussions had among all the humor. I also think that it's important that you know that at one point I lost my pencil, and so I started underlining with my daughter's crayon, which feels appropriate for what type of book this is. There was also a point where she felt that she needed to help me underline, and so you can't even tell which parts I underlined because she was helping. But I feel like if it's gonna happen in a book, Discworld feels like the right one. Next thing I finished, if I made you sad for the condition that I put guards under, you wait. Vagabond. I read the first 3 volumes of Vagabond in this wonderful, beautiful, amazing bind-up that fell apart completely. The binding failed me immediately in this book and pages started falling out, but then I read it so carefully. I was so gentle with this daggum book. And even though I was, when I finished reading it, I went back to reread a couple of things just to refresh my mind, to answer a couple of questions, and it just died. It just completely died. Anyway, this follows a man who is a very talented martial artist, very talented fighter, and it just follows his story, his friendships, his code, him being challenged and kind of redirecting things. I don't know, it's a very slow beginning, so I don't have a lot to say about it at this point, spoiler free, but I will be doing spoiler-filled discussions with my friend Philip Chase, who I did spoiler-filled discussions with the Finland Saga series, book by book. With him, we'll do book by book discussions on Vagabond as well, starting in February. So if you're interested in discussing this further, we will. Next up, I read Island of the Lost, which is a nonfiction following 2 shipwrecks that happen on the same island, on opposite sides of the island, and at the same time, and they never knew about each other. This is a true story. This actually happened. And it's really interesting just because it's an interesting story in and of itself, the shipwrecks and survival and all that kind of stuff, but it's also really interesting because of how extremely different they are. One shipwreck, the leadership, ingenuity, camaraderie, resourcefulness that they displayed was fascinating to read about, but then the other shipwreck, how quickly they deteriorated and fell apart under lack of leadership is just really fascinating. So it's an interesting account to read in and of itself, but it's also an interesting discussion on the importance of leadership. You know, these two separate shipwrecks under the same conditions at the same time, how vastly different they were, with different leadership. And obviously there's a human side of it, like the different people are there too, but yeah, just very, 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 very different results. Narratively, I didn't think it was the strongest nonfiction I've read. It read very much like somebody who read a series of journals and then recounted them, as opposed to someone who read a series of journals and then created a strong narrative thread, bringing it all together. So if that matters to you, you know, go in knowing that. But it was a really interesting story. I very much enjoyed reading it. I took this with me on vacation, and my husband's cousin, who was traveling with us, took it from me and read it. And he really enjoyed it. And the final book that I read this month was Folk Stories from the Hills of Puerto Rico. This is a collection of folk stories from Puerto Rico. I read it while I was in Puerto Rico. It was fun to learn about how these were passed down orally originally, and then what caused them to be written down and why there are multiple versions of them. It was fun to read different versions of stories that I'm already familiar with. I've already read the Grimm's fairy tales for Cinderella and Snow White, and now I got to read the Puerto Rican versions. And in some instances, it was very different, and in some instances, it was similarities with big differences. I also got to read some new folk stories that I've never heard before, I've never read before, and it was fun. Fairy tales are weird, so it was fun to read them on the beach and then recount them to my family and be like, listen to this one. It was nice to get a piece of culture and history of Puerto Rico while hanging out in Puerto Rico. I had a great time. Oh hey, one more thing that I read last night, which I'm recording this section on the 1st. So yesterday, last day of the month, I read more of my thing, and that was to finish Vinland Saga, or to finish being caught up with Vinland Saga according to published work. So what that means is I read the second half of book 12, which is 1 volume, and then I read book 13, which is 2 volumes. So I read 3 volumes of Vinland Saga, which means that my stats in the beginning are slightly incorrect. I don't care. I'm not gonna redo it again. Anyway, what I did was I started the next arc of Vinland Saga. I've been reading them arc by arc and giving arc by arc reviews on this channel, and then on the second channel I've been doing book by book discussions with my friend Philip Chase, which I've already mentioned earlier in this video. And at the time that I'm recording this aside, I'm about to sit down and discuss this with him. So if you are interested in Vinland Saga, if you've read these and you want a spoiler-filled discussion, I will link you to his channel where the final Vinland Saga discussion for published works will be. But for my spoiler-free thoughts, it was a great start of this arc, what I assume is going to be the final arc of Vinland Saga. It was a very strong start, and I am very excited to see where Yukimura continues to take this series and how he wraps it all up. He does an excellent job of grounding this story in history while giving it his own commentary and his own slant. So yeah, I've enjoyed this series from start to now, so I enjoyed this part too. Okay, those are all the books that I read in the month of January. If you want to discuss some of them with me, please do. I post videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on this channel, Tuesdays and Thursdays on the second channel. I'll see you again soon. Bye.